All right, kids, I'm going to get ready to talk about EFW chapter 5 through 7, and then I'm going to read you chapters 8 and 9. All right, if we'll remember back in chapter 5, the setting was still Warsaw, it's still World War II, it's somewhere probably between 1941 and 1945. We still have Joseph as a main character, but now the boy has a name. In chapter 5, I believe, is when we find out that his name is Jan. He tells Joseph specifically that he does not tell people his name, but because of the silver sword and their encounter there, and because Joseph gave him the silver sword, Jan has agreed to reveal his name. And his name, even though it's spelled Jan, that initial J makes the sound that a Y would make. So his name is Jan. Take my word for it. All right, so in chapter 5, of course, we could probably find one of each type of conflict in that chapter, but I chose man versus society conflict to share with you because the Nazis are in charge and they have taken over the railways, and so the only people can use them are the Nazis unless maybe you've got permission to ride them. Joseph doesn't have permission to get on the train. Of course, he's an escaped convict, and if they found him, the best case scenario is they would send him back to a prison camp. Worst case scenario is if he were captured, he would be killed. Because he's going to jump on this train without permission, certainly without having a ticket of any sort, but because it's been run by the military, because he doesn't have permission, he would definitely be shot if he were found trying to board this train, because they would probably think that he was some kind of a spy or saboteur or something like that. All right, so the text-to-text, I picked a text-to-text connection here for our text connection, and specifically it reminded me in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the White Witch, she's taken over Narnia, and she has these laws that all the Narnians have to live by, and if they don't, then they suffer the consequences. Remember, she would turn the Narnians into stone if they were caught violating her laws, and that would be sort of similar to being put in prison or being shot. Of course, we know that Aslan was able to breathe on them and bring them back to life. Okay, so the summary that I came up with for chapter 5 is short and sweet. Jan helped Joseph escape Warsaw on the goods train. All right, let's think about chapter 6. In chapter 6, the setting is still Warsaw. It's still World War II. It's still the same time period as chapter 5. The only difference here in chapter 6, we have a switch of main characters. Joseph is not in the picture now. We know what he's doing. We know he's on his way traveling towards Switzerland, but he's not going to come back into the story for a while. So we've shifted our main characters. We've got Ruth, Eddick, and Branya. The Belitsky children now are taking over as the main characters. Okay, so I chose a person versus self conflict because in chapter 6, each one of these children have to confront their fear. Fear can either cause you to freeze it, or it can cause you to want to flee. But we all have to deal with our fear in our own way. And so each of these children had to deal with their fear in order to get out of that house before the Nazis blew it up and killed them. Okay? And so Ruth had to handle Ruth's fear, Edic had to handle Edic's fear, and they had to convince Branya that she had to handle her own fear, or else they would have gotten caught. Okay, text connection. I came up with a text to world connection, and this just is for me. Y'all might think of a different conflict or a different text connection, but for my text connection, I was thinking text to world, because as they were fleeing from the Nazis, they had to go into hiding from the Nazis because the Nazis wanted to kill them. Okay, and so this reminds me of the story of Corrie ten Boom and Anne Frank, who were both real people, real women who dealt with the Nazis. Corrie ten Boom was a lady that she and her family hid Jews from the Nazis, and she herself didn't hide from the Nazis, but she helped hide them from the Nazis. Eventually, after a long time of hiding Jews in her home, she and her sister and her father were all put into a concentration camp for that. Anne Frank was a Jewish girl where she and her family and some other people went into hiding from the Nazis. Eventually, after a long time of being in hiding, they also were captured and put into a concentration camp. Anne Frank died in the concentration camp. She was a girl not much older than you fifth graders are now, but Corrie ten Boom, she survived. Her father died in the concentration camp. Her sister died in the concentration camp. She lived. She eventually came to the United States, and she lived to be, I think, probably into her late 70s or 80s. There's a very famous book about her. It's called The Hiding Place. Okay, and so my chapter summary for this chapter is the Blitsky kids escaped from their home before it was blown up. They found a cellar in a bombed out house in which to take shelter. All right, let's go on to chapter 7. Okay, in chapter 7, the setting is inside the city of Warsaw during the winter time, and it was the countryside outside of Warsaw in the summertime. It's still World War II, still about the same time period as the previous chapters, although because it comes after the action of chapter 6, it's a little bit later in time, but it's still that time before 1945. Okay, the main characters are still Ruth, Edic, and Branya. Conflict. I picked a person versus society conflict. Again, this goes to rules that the Nazis set up, and the country of Poland, they had, even though the Nazis were in charge of it, they still had a Polish Relief Society that kind of worked with the Nazis, and so the people who were there, they had to have ration cards. And you couldn't get food without these ration cards. So Ruth has one, Branya has one, Edic does not have one because he's at the age where he's a teenage boy. He's pretty young and pretty strong, and he would be good slave labor to send into Germany, kind of like what they did with Marguerite. Okay, so he doesn't have one. He wants to fly under the radar, so to speak. He doesn't really want the Nazis to know that he's around. Okay, so he couldn't get a ration card to get food for fear of being taken away by the Nazis. And so it's because of this that he worked. Sometimes he stole food. He worked on being a food smuggler so that he could provide food for him and extra food for his sisters. A text connection, I pulled out a text to world connection because this reminds me of the ration books that my grandparents had so that they could get food here in the United States during World War II. It wasn't as bad as it was in Europe, but there were certain things that you just couldn't get. Even here in the United States, you could only get them sometimes, or you could only get them in certain quantities if you had these ration books that had stamps in that. That might be like meat or sugar, dairy sometimes. So think about now how sometimes your parents might have talked about going to the grocery store and certain kinds of food not being in there because people have been panic buying. It's a little bit like that, except for in World War II, they were taking all this extra food and they were shipping it out to where the army, the soldiers were, to feed them. And so there would be shortages here in the United States. So people here had to have ration books. That's what that reminded me of. All right, so my chapter summary is the Blitzky kids lived in Warsaw in the winter and in the surrounding countryside during the summer. Eddick worked to provide food for them while Ruth ran a school for Branya and the other kids. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about the school in this chapter because that's going to come back in in subsequent chapters. All right, so let's get ready to listen to Escape from Warsaw, Chapter 8. This is called The Newcomer. 2 years passed without any news of Eddick. Ruth and Branya returned to Warsaw each winter and back to the woods again the following summer. It was the summer of 1944. Okay, let's remember that in Chapter 8, we're in 1944. It was the summer of 1944. Out in the woods, they began to realize that things were changing. Day and night, the air was full of planes. From the distant city, they could hear the boom of guns and the explosion of bombs. It was rumored that the Nazis were on the defensive. Though the children did not know it till later, the Russian Marshal Rokovsky was sweeping westward with 7 great army groups, driving the Nazis before him. Moscow had broadcast a call to the resistance in Warsaw. Poles, the hour of freedom is at hand. Poles, to arms. Do not lose a moment. The suburbs of Warsaw are already within the range of Russian guns. At once the Poles, under their own General Boer, rose up against the German garrison. At 5 o'clock on the afternoon of August the 1st, a bomb went off in the Nazi Gestapo headquarters. At the same moment, thousands of windows in the city were flung open, and a hail of bullets struck the passing Germans. All traffic ceased as the Polish underground rushed to the attack. Starving people streamed out of the cellars and flung themselves upon the Nazis, attacking with weapons if they had them, with their fists if they had nothing else. But the Germans counterattacked from their strongholds. Hastily, they concentrated 5 divisions and their Tiger tanks drove a wedge through the city as far as the Vistula. The Soviet troops outside withdrew 6 miles under orders from Moscow, leaving the Poles to fight their own battle. General Boer was short of arms and ammunition and could not continue the struggle alone. He radioed for help to Britain and America, but the British and Americans were too busy fighting the Nazis in the West. Prime Minister Churchill cabled to Stalin a request to help the Poles, but Stalin refused. He even refused to allow British and American planes carrying supplies to land on Soviet airfields. So the Poles, desperately short of food and arms, were left to fight it out to the bitter end. A few stragglers from the city turned out by the Nazis to find their own safety reached the woods. From them, Ruth learned of Nazis having to fight for every inch of ground, of Poles tearing up the pavement slabs and using them as barricades in the streets, and of a message sent to the Pope by the women of Warsaw. Most Holy Father, for 3 weeks we have lacked food and medicine. Warsaw is in ruins. No one is helping us. The world is ignorant of our fight. On October the 2nd, The 63rd day of fighting, when the defenders had no more ammunition left, Warsaw broadcast its last appeal to the people of the world. Without help, the struggle has become hopeless. God is righteous, and in his omnipotence, he will punish all those responsible for this terrible injury to the Polish nation. Too late to save the gallant defenders, Stalin changed his plans and ordered the Russians to march. By January 1945, the Nazis had gone and Warsaw was in Russian hands. Because of the fighting, Ruth and Branya had put off their return to the city till as late as possible. They had left it till winter had already set in, and cold and hunger drove them and other families from the woods. A rude shock awaited them. The Warsaw they had known and lived in all their lives had vanished. The old town had been wiped out, and there were no streets left. Food was shorter than it had ever been, only a little flour, fat, and sugar, no milk at all. Luckily, there was water. Though the mains had been damaged, fresh wells had been dug. Somehow they found their way to the cellar that had been their home for 2 years. There were signs that it had been occupied during the summer, then abandoned. The chairs and beds had gone, probably used as firewood, and the table was broken. There was a dark hole at one end, which Ruth found to be the beginning of a tunnel. It led under the street, joining with other cellars, other homes. Because of the firing and bombing, no one had used the streets unless he had to. With the help of the clever network of tunnels, the brave defenders had kept the struggle going all autumn. Patiently and without despair, Ruth set to work to repair the damage. They had no beds, but they still had the blankets they had brought with them from the woods. Friends provided them with sacks to sleep on. Some boys in Ruth's class mended the table and made chairs from boxes. When all was as straight as she could make it, Ruth started up her school again. Some 16 children were squeezed into the cellar. Lessons were always under cover now. One day something happened which was to change the whole course of her life and to give hope to her flagging spirit. It was a sunny day, and for once there was no firing. The children were out of doors playing a game called Air Raid Alert. One of them would cry, "Alert!" and count to 50 while the others ran for shelter before he shouted, "Stop." Anyone who had not found a hiding place by then had to lie down and pretend to be dead. Suddenly Branya, who was very proud because she had never been dead yet, came running down to Ruth in the cellar. "There's a boy lying down outside, and he won't get up," she cried. "Tickle his ribs," said Ruth. "I don't think he can get up," said Branya. "Who is it?" "It's not one of the class. I've never seen him before." Ruth went out to investigate. Lying on a heap of rubble was a ragged boy who might have been any age between 9 and 13. His cheeks were thin and pale, and his eyes were closed. A mangy cock, that's a rooster, a mangy cock with more bone than feather, stood by his head and squawked at anyone who went near him. Ruth chased the rooster away and knelt beside the boy. "Does anyone know who he is?" she asked the ring of children round her. Nobody did. "He looks ill and starved," said Ruth. "Yankel, will you help me lift him down to the cellar? And Eva, please find something for him to eat, some soup if you can get it." They carried him down to the cellar and laid him gently on the sacks. After a little while he opened his eyes. "Where's Jimpy?" he said. "We'll find Jimpy later," said Ruth. "I think you must have fainted. You'll be all right in a minute." "I want Jimpy," said the boy. "Perhaps Jimpy's the name of the cock," said Branya. "Yankel, go fetch the cock," said Ruth. "No fear, he's bitten me twice," said Yankel. Ruth was going to fetch it herself when the cock appeared suddenly in the hole in the wall, squawked, flapped its dusty wings, and jumped down beside the boy. "Jimpy, Jimpy," said the boy, and he reached out his arms towards the mangy creature. "He's a fine rooster, and he's got a fine name. said Ruth. What's your name? Shan't tell you, snapped the boy. Look, Eva's brought some soup for you, said Ruth. You'll feel better in a minute. Sit up and drink it. He won't tell us his name, Branya confided to the crowd at the door. A girl pushed through the crowd and went over to Ruth. She had something in her hand. I found this in the street where he was lying, she said. I think it must be his. It was a small wooden box. Branya seized it. It's heavy and it rattles. He must be rich, she cried. Ruth, may we undo the string? Give the box to him, said Ruth. Nobody shall touch it without asking him. The boy took the wooden box and smiled. Everyone wanted to look inside, but he wouldn't open it. However, he told them his name. It was Jan. Chapter 9. The Russian Sentry. A sentry is a guard. It's a soldier. For some days, Jan was too ill to leave. What he needed was rest, warmth, and good solid food. The children scrounged what food they could. It was easier to get now that the Russians had come and left the nursing to Ruth. Jan had wrapped his wooden box in a piece of sacking which he used as a pillow and lay on the floor quite contented. Jimpy the rooster stood over him as bodyguard, and Ruth was the only person it would allow near him. By the time Jan was better, he didn't want to go, so he made his home with Ruth and Branya and became one of the family. Branya was very curious to know what was in the wooden box, but Jan never opened it. There was no chance for anyone else to open it either, for he carried it about with him wherever he went. Several streets away there had appeared a brand new hut, which was a Russian control post. One afternoon, Ruth called there. Don't stand there staring at me, little girl, said the burly sentry who was on duty. I'm not a little girl. I'll be 18 next week, said Ruth. And I want to see your officer. The whole of Warsaw wants to see my officer. Run away and play. It's very important. Run away. Ruth was angry. It's all right for you. You've got plenty to eat and drink and warm clothes too and a bed to sleep in. Didn't you come here to set us free? You must let me see your officer. The sentry grinned. Well, seeing it's your birthday next week, I might stretch a point, but I don't hold out much hope that he'll see you. He disappeared inside the post. A moment later he came out. The lieutenant says come back the year after next, said the sentry. Before he realized what had happened, Ruth had pushed past him and into the post. A worried-looking lieutenant was sitting at a desk typing. Hey, you young girl, come out, cried the sentry. Leave her to me, Ivan, said the lieutenant, and Ivan went out, swearing under his breath. You're a determined young lady, said the lieutenant. I am not a little girl, anyway, said Ruth. What is it you want? I want food and clothes and blankets, pencils, and as much paper as you can spare. I've got 16 children. The lieutenant gasped and nearly fell into the wastepaper basket. 17 if you count the one that's lost. He really is mine. He's my brother, Eddick. So is my sister, Branya. The others are just my school. They're all half starving, and they're keen to learn, and they've got nothing to write on, and I want you to help me to find Eddick. He's been lost over a year. Anything else you'd like me to do? Said the lieutenant. He waved a thick pad of papers. See this file? It's full of missing people, about 10 to each page. All Warsaw's missing. Hopeless. One more name won't make a little difference, said Ruth. I might as well burn the lot for all the good it is. Oh, don't do that, said Ruth. I see the writing's only on one side. Give me the papers and we can use the blank side in school for writing on. The lieutenant laughed, and Ruth laughed too. Sit down, he said, and I'll take your particulars, but I warn you nothing will come of it. Before going, she was told to call back the next day. She called and found a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, and 6 blankets waiting for her. "It's more than you deserve, you little hussy," said Ivan. "Sign here, and your address." She wrote "bombed cellar" and told him where it was. A week later, with the help of the sugar and flour, a wood fire, and a biscuit tin for an oven, she was preparing a birthday tea. Most of the children had been invited. Suddenly she heard sounds of a scuffle outside. She ran out and saw a soldier being attacked by a boy. There was a flash of a knife near the soldier's neck, and Jimpy the rooster was squawking and pecking at his ankles. "Jan, drop that knife at once," she cried. "Drop it. Do you hear me?" She flung herself into the struggle. They all rolled over in a heap, but she had caught Jan by the wrist and knocked the knife out of his hand. "That's a pretty welcome, I must say," said Ivan the sentry, as he picked up his cap and knocked the dust off. He tried to put it on his head, but the rooster jumped on his shoulder and pecked his ear. Ruth drove it away, then picked up the fallen knife. "Don't you understand, Jan? They're our friends," said Ruth. "They're soldiers," said Jan sulkily. "They're Russian soldiers, not Nazis. They've come to set us free and look after us." "I hate soldiers. They're all the same," said Jan. "I hate them." "I'm sorry about him, Ivan," said Ruth. "His manners are as bad as Jimpy's. Come inside. We're going to have a party. Come in, Jan." Everyone went in except Jan, who stayed outside sulking. "So I chose the right day to call, young lady," said Ivan. "My word, a birthday! Too old to have them myself." "You shall have the seat of honor, Ivan," said Ruth, and she gave him a box to sit on. Ivan sat down and got up rather quickly, rubbing his seat. 2 inches of rusty nail. That's not the sort of honor I appreciate," he said. "Did nobody ever teach you how to use a hammer?" "I haven't got a hammer. I used half a brick," said Ruth, and picking up a piece of brick from the floor, she flattened the offending nail so that Ivan could sit down without further injury. "Brought a present for you," said Ivan, when he was settled comfortably. "Nothing much, but my kids at home are fond of it. Bar of chocolate." "What's chocolate?" said Branya, while Ruth thanked him. She wasn't the only one who wanted to know what chocolate was. There were 15 in the cellar. Ruth divided it into 15. "Just about a crumb each. They won't tell from that. Wish I'd brought some more," said Ivan. "But I didn't come here to bring chocolate. I've got news for you, young lady. We've traced your brother Edic. He's in a transit camp at Posen." Ruth threw her arms around his neck. "What would the wife say if she could see me now?" said Ivan, and he planted a loud kiss on Ruth's cheek. Then he returned to the business in hand. "Of course I had to handle the matter myself. If the lieutenant had done it, nothing would have come of it." He handed her a slip of paper on which the name of the camp was written. "And here's something else might come in handy." He gave her a large packet of typewriting paper and a bundle of pencils. Branya clapped her hands for joy. "I'll draw lots of pictures of you, Ivan, rolling on the floor and having your ear pecked and sitting on the nail," she said, then added, "Did you pay for all this by yourself?" "That's not the way we do things in the army," said Ivan. "I hope you didn't steal it," said Ruth. "And that's not the word we use for it," said Ivan. "Just tidied it up, you might say. It's a help to you, and it's a help to the lieutenant, because he can't wear himself out typing anymore." "Don't tell Jan," said Ruth. "He's a dreadful thief, and it will only make him worse." At that moment she saw Jan standing in the doorway. He was sobbing. "Cheer up, son. I've forgiven you, even if you did want to cut off my head for a souvenir," said Ivan. But there was something for which Jan had not forgiven him. He held out his little wooden box. It was in pieces. You rolled on it, you great brute, and broke it, he said. I'll mend it for you, said Ivan. Jan shook his head fiercely. Jan, can't you stop hating for one moment? Asked Ruth. As Jan clutched the broken pieces to his chest, something fell to the ground. It was the silver sword that Joseph had given him more than 2 years before. Ruth picked it up and looked at it very closely. It was vaguely familiar. That dragon on the brass hilt. Where had she seen it before? Then suddenly she recognized it as the birthday present her father had given her mother the last year before the war. Then she too began sobbing. Waterworks, said Ivan, puzzled and embarrassed. First it was kill me, and then it was kiss me, and now it's the waterworks. Pardon me if I step outside and fetch my umbrella. And he went back to his control post, wondering what to make of it all. All right, I hope you enjoyed those chapters, and I'll read you some more on Wednesday or Thursday.